Today we are going to talk about the apportionment rule. And the apportionment rule is a method of calculating royalties when the lessor conveys a portion, hence its name, a portion of the oil and gas lease. Now, it's only in certain states, most notably California, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania. So, for those of you that are working the Marcellus Shale, you're going to really need to know the apportionment rule. Now, before we get started, I want to show you how the calculation is different depending on if it's in an apportionment state or a non-apportionment state. So most states are non-apportionment states. So let's look at what that calculation would be. In a non-apportionment state, the interest is the royalty interest. This is the lessor's net revenue interest is the royalty interest times the net unit acres divided by the gross unit acres. Now, when we're talking about the apportionment rule, there's an additional calculation, and that additional calculation is the lease net acres divided by the lease gross acres. But before we get into that, the best way to understand the apportionment rule is to understand the case from whence it came. And that is Weddingale versus Garmley. This is a 28A934. It's a Pennsylvania case, and it's in 1894, not 1994. So this is where the apportionment rule was created. So let me tell you the facts of the case, and you'll kind of see what the logic of the judges that made the decision. In 1888, James Garmley leased his interest in 570 acres to J.A. Tomlinson. And it was for a 1/8 lease and a 15-year term. Fast forward 2 years in 1890, Mr. Garmley passes away, and he leaves 3 heirs or 3 children, and the interest passes by testate probate. So he died with a will, and this is how the will set out the interest. He had 3 kids, James, Anna Wettengale, so you can kind of see where we're going here, and Marie Lockhart. And he didn't just give them each an undivided 1/3 interest. He gave them a certain parcel of this 570 lease. So James got 204 acres, Anna got 202 acres, and Marie, the baby, gets 165 acres. So let's look at what this parcel looks like, or this lease would look like. Marie is the baby, so she only got 165 acres. That's for Marie. And then, that's terrible. Then let's look at Marie. Marie has 165. And then James and Anna, really their interests are pretty much the same, 204 versus 202. So this is James's interest, and he has 204 acres. And this is Anna's interest, and she has 202 acres. Now, what happens is Tomlinson then drilled a bunch of wells, about 10 wells here, on James's parcel. And about 6 of those wells were successful. So James is getting all the royalty because all the wells are on his parcel. James thought this made perfect sense, but this did not sit well with Anna and Marie, who said, wait a minute, this was Daddy's lease, and Daddy's lease had 570 acres. So if Daddy had never died, it wouldn't matter where the leases were on this land. Daddy would get a share of the royalty. So we shouldn't be penalized because the lease is divided out. We should each get a share of this, all the royalty payment. Now keep in mind, this was before there was any notion of equitable pooling. Equitable pooling came into effect in like the 1930s. So you can see that the judge is looking at this and he's trying to be fair, and he agrees with them, and he says, they're right, that this was all one lease, so any royalties that occur on the lease, you have to pay to all of the parties in the lease because it was divided out. So that means James's interest would be 1/8 times his net lease acres divided by the gross lease acres. Anna's interest would be 1/8 times her lease net acres divided by the lease gross acres. And then Marie, the same thing, 1/8 times 165 divided by 570, the total gross lease acres. So that's how they calculated the interest. So the rule is that if the lessor, James Gormley, gives away a portion, so he gave a portion to this person, a portion to this person, and a portion to that person, any unit activity or any well activity or drilling activity, any royalty is going to be split out among everyone in the original lease. That is called the apportionment rule. Now, most states, as I said, have the non-apportionment rule, and this is this calculation here, all in the green. So let's look at how the apportionment rule applies if you are in one of those states and if there's a unit involved. So we're going to have new facts, and the new facts are that A is going to own a 160-acre land. A owns 160 acres. And that's A. And then B owns 160 acres. Okay. Now, what happens next is that there is a unit created, and the unit covers all of lease A and half of lease B. So the unit is 160 plus 80, or a 240-acre unit. So far, the calculation is going to be, let's say A leases for 1/8 and B leases for 1/8. Their calculation is going to be, A's calculation is going to be 1/8, 1/8 times lease net acres over the gross unit acres, 160 over 240. And then B's interest is going to be 1/8. Oh, let me change that color. B's interest is going to be 1/8 times the number of acres he has in the unit, 80 acres, divided by 240. But let's say that C then B conveys a part of his interest to C. So C is going to get this 40 acres here. What would C's interest be in a non-apportionment state? C's interest would be 1/8. Oh, C's interest would be 0 because C's 40 acres is not in the unit. Okay, so even if B had never sold it, this part of the acres, this acres would not be included in the calculation because it was not a part of the unit. So C would have 0 interest. So let's do the math here. This is 0.125. Times 160 divided by 240. The net acres in the unit divided by the total unit. Okay, so A's interest is going to be this 0.08333. And then B's interest is going to be, let's do that math, 0.125 times 80, his total acres in the unit, this part right here. 80 divided by the total unit acres, 240. So this would be B's interest, 0.041666.7. 0.041666.7. Did I get that right? Yeah. Okay, so that would be B's interest. And then, as we said, C's interest, because C is not in the unit, C's interest would be 0. So this is the way it would work under a non-apportionment state. But let's see what it would look like in an apportionment state, because what happened is that B has conveyed a portion of his lease to a third party, to C. So this is the way the calculation would work in an apportionment state. A's interest would be the same. A's interest would be 1/8 times 160 divided by 240. And that's going to be the 0.08333. But B's interest is going to change. B will still get the 1/8 royalty times the number of acres he has in the unit, which is 80 acres, divided by the total unit acres. Now we're going to have to add this additional calculation, that is his lease net over the lease gross acres. So his lease net, he had 160, he conveyed 40 to C, so his lease net is 120 acres, lease net, and the lease gross was originally 160 acres. So let's look at what that calculation looks like. 0.125 times 80 divided by 240. And now we have to add this additional calculation of times 120 divided by 160. So B's interest is now 0.03125. Now let's look at what C's interest is. C, remember, in a non-apportionment state had no interest because it was not in the unit. Not so in an apportionment state. In an apportionment state, C's interest would be 1/8 of the original lease times the total acres of the lease that's in the unit, that's 80, over the total unit acres, 240, and times the lease net, which is 40, divided by the total lease, which is 160. So before, C had nothing because C wasn't a part of the unit. But in an apportionment state, if B had conveyed a portion of his lease, C would then be entitled to a share of the unit royalty, even though it wasn't part of the unit. So let's look at what C's interest would be under the apportionment rule. And that interest would be a 0.125, 1/8 royalty, times 80 acres that are in the unit, divided by 240, times this additional calculation of 40 acres divided by the total lease acres of 160. So now C has an interest of 0.01041666. And that's the distinction between the apportionment rule and the non-apportionment rule. And it all occurred because B conveyed a portion of the lease. That triggered the rule. So in a non-apportionment state, C would have had 0. In an apportionment state, now C has a 0.01041666 interest, and B's interest was reduced in a non-apportionment state from 0.041667 to 0.03125. So B is getting less because he conveyed a portion of it. So that is the apportionment rule. I hope this was helpful, and we'll talk about the entireties clause in the next section.